Hey everyone, thank you so much for stopping by. My name is Tommy. If you're new to my channel, don't forget to subscribe, especially if what you see today inspires you, which I am definitely sure it will. So please do subscribe. Before we start, I'd like to say a massive thank you to Waterstone Blue Water for allowing this interview to take place. They're an amazing bookstore. The staff are amazing. They have an amazing selection of books for you to buy, read, and all of that. So please do support them. Thank you so much, Waterstone. And yes, before I start the interview, my subscribers know who I am. I'm a teacher by profession. I love meeting new people. I love telling stories. I love when someone has achieved something or they have a story to tell. I want to bring such people to you guys so you can be inspired. So with me today, I have got one of the most, honestly, I'm not just saying this, one of the most amazing people that I've met. And I am going to let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Florence Olajide and I'm an author. I'm also an educator. I live in the UK. I am a mother and a grandmother.
If I pick up a book, it might take me a year to finish it. But this book, honestly, I read in a matter of like a week and a bit. I couldn't put it down. But we're going to talk about that in a bit. Let's get to know Florence a little bit more. So we're gonna get to know you a little bit more. So can you tell me one word that best describes you?
Resilient.
Resilient. Why? Why would you say that?
I've had to be just to make it through life from when I was a child. And even though I didn't know I was resilient then, when I think back on my childhood, it's the one word that describes how I've dealt with the challenges that life has thrown at me. So it's a word that resonates with who I am, who I've become. And over the years, it's a skill that I've really needed to harness and hold on to in order to cut my way through the wilderness, as it were, and get to where I wanted to be in life.
Amazing. Okay, right. So to the part of the interview that I'm looking forward to. Let's talk about your journey into being an author. So when you were much younger, was it something that you always wanted to do?
The answer to that is no. It was not a dream of mine. It wasn't a plan. It was just something that happened. Like a lot of things that have happened to me in my life. I actually started writing my memoir in 2005. And even then, the intention wasn't necessarily to publish it. It was just a suggestion that had come my way several times from people who I'd shared a bit of my life with. And so I'd started writing then, and I still remember when I first started writing, I didn't know who my audience was for. And so the very first iteration of the writing was just a record of things that had happened to me over time. And it was only later that the book itself began to take form and take shape.
And what was that thing that pushed you that, right, I am actually going to do this?
The COVID lockdown was the catalyst for getting it finished. What had happened over the years is I found that when I write, I go into a space where nothing else exists for me, which is extremely difficult to do when you are a teacher or a head teacher. And when I first started writing, I was a head teacher of a primary school in London. So I found that the only time in my year where I could indulge and just shut myself away from the rest of the world was during school breaks, particularly the summer breaks. And I found that by the time I sort of de-stressed from the job, got my head into that space where I wanted to write, I'd have to reread everything I'd written before because I would have forgotten. And then I'd write perhaps a chapter or even less, and the holidays would be over. So that cycle repeated itself for years and years and years until lockdown. At that point, I thought, well, I'm not working, I'm not in schools. Now I work as an education consultant, so I visit schools when they're in session. If they're not, then I have no work. So I just thought, well, this is a gift. I'll never know when I'll get that space to do nothing but just write. So that's exactly what I did.
Any writers or authors or want to be authors who are watching, this question I think would help. What do you think makes a good writer?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. But from what I've read, I think it's a book that people don't want to put down. But every book is different, and I think, and so are people. So what appeals to me might not appeal to you. But I think that there is something about a book that captivates you, and certainly when I think about the books that I read, the ones that I stay up all night for, even though I know I'm going to work
exactly the next day,
it's because I'm invested in the character, and I'm desperate to see what happens next. And there is just something about the pace that moves me on. That means I just want to get to the end, and I don't want to do anything else. Nothing else matters until I find out what happens to this character.
From picking up your pen and to getting published, I've spoken to a lot of people who want to get into writing as well. When we have conversations, they think it's really straightforward, it's easy. You know, they think they can just write a book, and then the pace that they have, they can just go ahead and, you know, sell it to publishers. What did you have to do? Those kind of processes that you go to before you approached agents and things like that. Because I think sometimes people don't understand that there is a process to getting that book published. It's not as easy as we think.
I'm going to put my hands up. To be fair, my path has not been the norm. But I do have, my daughter's an author, and I know her path was a lot more difficult. And she went through what I would call the normal process, which is about sending your work out, and crafting it, making sure that it's a good piece of work, before sending it out to people. And in the early stages, before I actually finished the book, I did actually look into that process. So what was it I needed to do? And part of that was making sure that you were sending your work to people who might be interested in it. So you just don't send it out to everyone, because fatigue will set in very quickly if you do that. But that you're a bit selective in who you're sending your work out to. You've done your research on them. You know that they take they work with authors like you, or they have published books, not exactly the same, because nobody wants the same two books on their hands, but the sort of genre that you're looking at, or they themselves have published and said, you know, in their blurb about themselves, that they're looking for this type of material. So that kind of research is important. I was just fortunate that I was in the right time at the right space. So I actually never went through that process of sending my work out to a lot of people. I took part in a Twitter contest called Pit Mad. And in which you pitch your work in a sentence or two, and any authors who, any publishers or agents who are interested might then invite you to make a submission. Right. And that's what happened in my case. I just literally was in the right place at the right time to hear about it. Never heard of it before, and so the pitch went out, and as a result of that, I think about 5 people invited me to submit, and at that point they didn't even realize that it was a memoir, that it was non-fiction. They thought it was fiction. But I submitted to those people. 2 of them were in America, and they came back and said, actually, we don't do non-fiction. And then one of them was in the UK, and she came back and said, actually, I'm a fiction publisher, but I'd like you to send this work to the non-fiction department in my publishing house. They read it, they liked it, and that was it. So I didn't go through that process of having to send it out to lots of people.
Right. Right, so I would like to tell the audience that this is officially my favorite book as of now. It is absolutely amazing. I couldn't put it down, you know. I love your style of writing. Do you know, a lot of the times when I was reading it, and one of the reasons I'll tell you why I couldn't put it down is I felt like I was there with you. There were some parts some things that you had gone through, you know, that I could relate to. You know, and I thought, wow. And it was interesting to see the way you dealt with it, you know. So apart from the fact that I enjoyed reading it, I learned a lot from it as well, you know, because being from Nigeria originally as well, you know, there's so many things that I didn't know, you know, that I learned a lot from this book. And then, you know, what you went through when you were early on in London, and when you transitioned to Nigeria, that was a big transition, you know, and it was really great to read that, because I do know stories of people who had the same, journey that you did back then, in the 1960s. And, it's interesting because not all of them have come out to say what they experienced, but this is such a learning tool as well. That's what I found, like, wow, this is what happened to those people that people don't usually think about, but that's why one of the reasons I love this book so much, going to Nigeria and, expressing how you felt and what you went through, with grandma and, with meeting your husband. I mean, it's just an amazing read. So many times when I was reading, I laughed with you, I cried with you, I sympathized, it was just absolutely amazing. But I want to pick some moments in the books that I just thought were really interesting. I loved, one of the parts was when, I hope it's okay to say this, when you had your boss come round to your house and you had cooked, and in terms of different cultures and understanding where people are from, and just that language that was used, and you perceived it in a different way, and what happened. And so can you tell us, like, one of your favorite moments that you enjoyed writing so much about in the book?
I think the first one would probably be my first experience of a Nigerian wedding. Right. It was just so overwhelming. And given that I had been to my foster mum's daughter's, my foster sister's wedding, the two were nothing alike, and yet they took place within a year or two between them. Right. So it was just the vibrancy of the culture and all the drama that went with the wedding. So I think I really enjoyed recreating that and just sort of describing it. I mean, in many ways, the practice is still similar. I think people have modernized things quite a bit, and some things have changed. But that process of the engagement between both families and the fact that wedding contract is not just between the couple getting married, but between the two families, I found that fascinating, and I really enjoyed writing about that bit.
What about identity? Because in the book, you talked about struggling a lot with who you are. And I can identify with that as well, because I had the same struggles growing up. Like, where do I fit in? Even up till now, I'm like, when people ask me certain questions, I'm like, what do I say? Especially but where are you originally from question. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I started life out in Britain as a black child, being raised in a white British home for the first 6 years. And then transitioned to Nigerian transition. I say the word loosely because there was no transition. Right. One day I was here, the next day I was on the ship going there. And in Nigeria, I didn't fit in any form or shape, even though I was amongst people who all looked like me. And so to all intents and purposes, I should have been at home. But I wasn't, because my psyche was that of a white British girl, because I've been raised in a white British home. And the way I looked at the world was completely different to the way they did. And so my life from that moment on was a constant battle, a constant conflict with the cultural norms that were so different to anything I'd been used to. And I suspect that the combination of my age and my personality type meant that I couldn't be reformed easily. And while I lived there as well, because of those behaviors that I exhibited all the time, I was called Uyibo, which in Nigerian Yoruba terms meant white person. So there I was living in a black nation amongst black people, and I was being called a white child. So I grew up with that sense of actually not belonging and not fitting in. And then when I came back to the UK, I was in my 20s. So now, because of the challenges I had living in Nigeria, I'd idolized what my youth had been like here. And you see those years through rose-tinted glasses, if they were easy enough. And for me, they were. I was loved. So when I came back, I came back with the sense of I've come home, that this is where I belong. And then you start hitting the racism, both overt and covert, and suddenly people start saying, where are you from? And you think, what do you mean where I'm from? I'm from here. Yes. I belong here. Why are you asking me that? So it really messed with my head. Yes. And I struggled for a long time with that. I remember once being in Peckham shopping, and and someone had asked that question, and I bristled. And it was, the reaction was so visceral, it was so strong, and I'm sure that person would have thought, well, what did I say? They didn't know they touched a nerve. For a long time, I struggled with who I was, you know. And I remember when I first came back, one way of coping with that struggle was to deny every aspect of my Nigerian identity. And it was so strong, that instinct was so strong, that I stopped eating the food, I stopped wearing the clothes, I wouldn't go to the local markets, which meant my family did not eat Nigerian food for years.
No eba, ila, none of that.
Nothing at all. While I was trying to find myself and recreate who I wanted to be. And it was only as I became more successful at work, so I could anchor my identity on my job, as it were, that I sort of started to settle down a little bit. And then gradually, and then the process of parenting, because now my children were at age where, you know, their identity was developing, and they were challenging me on things that were just normal to me, but which in their eyes weren't. And that made me then start really thinking about the whole concept of self and identity and culture and what makes you who you are. So at that point, I actually started to read about it and do some research about it, and then I began to get a sense of who I was. And my methodology was to sort of say there are aspects of me that are black, Yoruba, Nigerian, and there are aspects of my identity that are white, and there's no denying it. I mean, I'll give an example. Remember once one of my sisters-in-law said, you go to her house, you're not going to find a pot of soup. Now, you know what I mean by that, because in a typical Nigerian home, you know, you cook a big pot of soup, and then you eat the soup down over a number of days. And if guests come or anyone visits you, there's always a pot of soup, Nigerian stew, that you can use to serve and be hospitable. I don't do that. You know, if I cook a pot of soup, then it's going down that night and it's done and dusted. Tomorrow it's going to be another meal. So it's very un-Nigerian. And so I had to come to that point where I had to understand the bits of me that were Nigerian, and they were, particularly when it came to parenting. And there were bits about, you know, me that were very British. And it was about finding somewhere in the middle that worked for me. And that's what I did, and that's what sort of helped me to get to that point where I felt comfortable with myself, with my identity, and I you know, I'd see, you know, pick an ethnicity on the form, and it didn't trigger me anymore, whereas at one point it did. The first 2 years in secondary school were an interesting period. In one way, they were an escape from my grandmother. So for that reason, that first year was a relief. Second year was tougher. I'd made some decisions, and if you read the book, you'll find out what they were. I made some decisions in my first year that came back to haunt me in my second year. So my second year was tougher, and living in poverty made it a bigger challenge. So for my third year, I didn't really want to go back to boarding school, and I sort of machinated in a way that made sure that my father did not send me back to boarding school. So my final 3 years at secondary school were easier in terms of me navigating through life. I may have had more fun if I'd been in boarding school, but those years were fine, and I sort of really just sort of grew into myself. University was an eye-opener because I entered university before I clocked my 16th birthday, and I was in an environment full of adults, and I wouldn't say had a sheltered upbringing, but I had a restricted upbringing. So I really, when I was at home, up until that moment, I really couldn't go out. I couldn't go anywhere. You know, if I left home at 2, I needed to be back at 4. My mother placed very huge restrictions on my movement. So when I got to university, I was wild.
All the ducking out before.
Say any more than that.
You got to read the book. You got to read the book to see why we're laughing, because I know why I'm laughing. Absolutely amazing. Okay, I wanted to ask you this question as well. Why? I know why people should grab this book and read, but why do you think people should go out? More people should go, because I know a lot of people have bought your book and they have amazing things to say about it, which we'll talk about in a bit. But why do you think people should go out to buy this book?
I think if you're struggling with identity, if you're caught between two worlds or even more than that, then it might help you to sort of understand you're not alone. And a lot of the people who've reached out to me, it's the one message they all have in common, that, you know, and some of those people have been white people who have dual heritage between two European countries with two completely different cultures, and so it would appeal to anyone who is caught between cultures, and hopefully might help you navigate some of that, and sort of figure out how you fit within your world. I think it's also useful for people who work with people who are caught between cultures. So if you're working with people who are immigrants, or whose families are, because even down to the second or third generations, those cultures filter down through parenting, through family expectations and norms and values, and it will help you understand where those children are coming from, and why some of the things you see, for instance, if you're a teacher in a classroom, that don't make any sense to you, but have a perfectly understandable explanation. So I think it's helpful for people like that. And also my daughters, and certainly their generation, where they sort of think that it helps them to understand their parents, right, where their parents are coming from, because there's certain behaviours that make absolutely no sense if you're looking at them through British eyes, but if you then go back into the culture and understand where those things are coming from and why they are as they are, it kind of makes sense. So and generally people who are just really interested in finding out about different cultures and how they work will find it interesting.
And I can see your passion for the Yoruba culture, because you had a book before and it was specifically on Yoruba culture. And just what can you tell us quickly about that book and why you wrote that?
That book's actually not in print, and I actually self-published that. And the reason why I did was when I started to work, when I became a head, and I was in that position of privilege, but also in a position of power, and because my name was on the school board, a lot more Nigerian children started popping up and registering to enter the school, which was a good thing, which is interesting. But then I started to come across children who were like I was as a child. Even though they were living in Britain, they were still caught between the different cultural expectations at school as opposed to those at home. And so those children were navigating through this confusion and trying to understand what was expected of them. And since and in some of those children it started to manifest in their behaviors, which would be challenging in school but not at home. And in working with their parents, it was always that challenge of helping them to understand that actually at school we can't do what you do at home. Our values, expectations and norms are different, and this child needs consistency, so we have to work together. So I started to work with those parents to sort of break things down for them and sort of in some ways show them alternatives to some of the things they were doing to ensure that their children had some consistency in the messages that they were getting. When I then when I left headship, I went into Ofsted as an inspector for a few years, and when I left Ofsted I started to work as a freelance consultant, and I was working with schools who were still taking in loads and loads and loads of African children, you know, mostly in Greenwich and Bexley in those days. And so I found myself now doing teacher training. And explaining to the school leaders that, you know, this problem, this might be a way around it. This might be one of the things. I'll give you a typical example in one school where they found it extremely difficult to engage the reception children in water or sand play, particularly sand play. And every time the teacher asked the children to sort of engage with anything in the sand, the kids just burst into tears, and the teacher could not figure out what was going on. So I had to break it down to them that the child has probably been told by their mother not to come home with sand in their hair. And they were like, well, why? I mean, just wash it off. So I had to explain about Afro hair, sand and Vaseline, they don't mix, you know, and to give the school simple strategies like, okay, keep a pile of shower caps in the water and sand area, and before children play with the sand, get them to wear the shower caps, and that protects their hair from the sand. So it's little things like that. And I remember one or two teachers saying, well, you really ought to write a book about this. So for me, writing the books have always been about people saying you really ought to write a book about this. So I sat down and I wrote that book, and because it's very niche. It's not something any publisher would necessarily want to market, because it's very specific to the challenges that parents, teachers, social workers were having with that particular cultural group within the context of how it interacted with British culture. So I self-published it. It's currently out of print, although if you want a copy, send me an email.
Yes. We'll drop your email details at the end.
So that's what prompted me to write that book. So I'd kind of been through the process of self-publishing, but as I said, it was a really small niche book, and
I can relate with what you said, and you know, it's important to bridge that gap, because I think for African parents as well, when they come over here, they don't understand the whole water play thing. It's like, no, I want my child to do math, I want them to do science, so I think, you know, with people like you explaining to them that no, the curriculum is actually different here. There is, you know, sand and water is part of play, but while they're playing, they're learning, you know. When I was reading the reviews about your book, I was just imagining how you feel reading this awesomeness people had to say about this book, right? So there are words like superb, riveting, moving, a powerful story, relatable. I had to write it down because there were so many. Inspiring, beautifully written, enjoyable. And one that caught my eye, and I thought, I'm going to read this out, you know, so people know how amazing this book is and why you should get it. My niece, by the way, she's only 9 and had been going on so much about this book. My dad knows about it now, my sister knows about it, and everyone wants to read it, right? So, and I'm telling them, go get a copy. So she's 9 and she's like, I want to read this book. And she's like, can you please ask Miss Florence if I can read this book even though I'm 9? So she wanted me to ask, can she read the book even though she's 9?
She probably needs to wait till she's 15.
You heard it from
I'm just a little bit worried that there's some trauma in there that's not appropriate for a 9-year-old.
So you've heard.
At
wait
the
till
very
you're 15.
least, let mommy read it first, and then let mommy decide when you should read
When
it.
you should read it. Okay, one that really caught my eye and I thought I want to read this out is, somebody said, an absolutely fantastic book. I struggle to put it down each night. I relate to that. Florence writes so beautifully, expressing clearly the challenges she faced growing up. An inspiring story of hope and striving to be a fairer world of independence and equality. I would definitely recommend this book to everyone. And I just thought that sums it up so beautifully. So if you're watching and you're thinking, oh, this book sounds interesting, please, please, please do go ahead and get a copy of this book. Apart from the fact that it's engaging, it's entertaining, it's funny, it's, you know, there are times that you feel, you know, there were times I felt angry on your behalf, and, you know, it just brings out a lot of emotions out of you. I also learned a lot about Nigeria at that particular period. You know, that was some interesting facts, and you know, there's some moments in the books as well that are funny. You know, it's just a book that I can guarantee you that if you pick up, you're not going to want to put down until you get to the end. So this is a very important part of the interview is, imagine there's somebody out there, they could be anywhere in the world, and they're looking at you and they've seen how successful you are, and they want to be like you. They have a story to tell, and you know, they just need someone to tell them, you know, give them a piece of advice. So what would you say to those kind of people?
I'd say, don't give up on your dreams. Have high expectations of yourself, even if everyone around you doesn't. I think it's important to aim for something, to want to be something. Whatever that is irrelevant so long as that's what you want to be. And I think holding on to that, and then be reflective. Even when people are giving you feedback you don't want to hear, there's a time and place to stop and ask yourself, is there a grain of truth to what they're saying? And if there is, then work on improving that, because the best, you want to be the best version of yourself you could possibly be. So surround yourself with people who value you, who care about you, and listen to the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then throw away the bad, improve the ugly, and get on with your life.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. Even I've learned something from that, because there was a point when I wanted to give up on my book and I just thought, this isn't working out. But when you hear people like yourself who have gone through, you know, all the hard work and you're so successful in your book, it makes me think, if Florence can do it, I can do it too. And I guess, you know, you can do it too. One last question actually that I wanted to ask. How did you feel about letting people into the personal things and, you know, what you basically wrote in your book? How did you feel about letting us in there?
It's an interesting one. I don't think it's a question I processed until after I'd made the final submission to my publisher. And then one day I sat there and I said, do I really want the whole world to know this much about me? But if you think about it, the book stops when I am somewhere around the age of 40. I'm almost 60.
Wow. So
that was 20 years ago. And I've kept growing since then. So the me now is the next iteration, you know, it's the Florence, you know, 5.9 version of Florence then. So in a sense, I've let you into my world 20 years ago. And I'd like to think that I've grown, developed, and become an even better version of that version then. So there's still a little bit of me that nobody knows about, that is still uniquely mine. So I have no problems in letting go in that sense. And I also think that if my story can help other people, and I know it has, and if it could only help one person, that's good enough for me. And I know it's helped more, because I've been in touch with some amazing people who've walked in similar footsteps. They've all got their own unique story, but they've found it healing. And so for me, that's a prize worth paying, to let those people find some hope that, one, they're not alone, and two, whatever they went through doesn't need to be what defines them. They can still go on and have a good life.
Amen. Amen to that. So if you're that person, you have a story to tell, you have a dream, please, please, please don't let it go. You have to do something about it. You know, maybe God has just given you something to share with the world, and if you hold on to it because of fear or excuses, then it's not going to help that one person or grow you as a person. So please, 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 if you have a story to tell, if you want to be an author, please get out there and do it. Just do it. You never know. You never know. You never know. Final question: is there going to be a coconut? What did you say? 5 points. 6 points. I want to read more. Like, okay, so what happens after? Because you ended where you're going to a new phase of your life. So it kind of stops. Then it's like, oh, so what happens next? So is there going to be? Yes. No?
Not really. I can't talk about the years when I was in the civil service because I signed the Official Secrets Act. So if I tell you, I'd have to kill you, James Bond style. I'm actually writing fiction now.
Okay.
And I'm very much, as you gathered from my memoir, I'm very much interested in history. And so I'm currently writing a bit of historical fiction that's set in 1880s Nigeria.
Oh, wow. Looking forward to that. So yes, definitely. So how can people get in contact with you if they wanted to?
You can get through contact with me through Twitter. My handle is @Florence Olajide. I'm on Facebook. Search for Florence Olajide author. On my website, florenceolajide.com. So just type my name in Google and it will come up somewhere.
And get connected with her. She's an amazing person.
I'd love to hear from you as well. If you do read the book, I'll always reply to people who reach out to me.
Please do reach out. She's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are. Thank you for spending your time with us, and God bless. Go out there and do what you're called to do. No fears, no excuses. Bye.
Bye.